Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, Strong Passions, a Scandalous Divorce in Old New York, with author Barbara Barbara Weisberg. Tonight's program is part of our series entitled Artists in the Archive, and in a few minutes you are going to see exactly why. The American Antiquarian Society is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. Our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources we've been collecting here since 1812. In addition to welcoming researchers from around the world and right here in Worcester to use the collections, physical and digital, we host programs like tonight's that provide insights into the past and its resonance for our own day. This program is being recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube page following the live stream, and I'm happy to welcome the folks who are here in person at the American Antiquarian Society and the folks who are watching us now on the live stream on YouTube. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. Now it is a pleasure to introduce Barbara Weisberg, whose work is a model of outstanding historical writing for wide audiences. She's delved deeply into mid-19th century America for many years now. Her earlier book, Talking to the Dead, Kate and Maggie Fox and the Rise of Spiritualism, traced the lives and careers of the sisters who founded 19th century American spiritualism. For that book, Barbara pursued research here at the American Antiquarian Society as a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fellow for Creative Writers and Artists. And I should note that in addition to the many scholars and academics who work here at AAS, we also have fellowships each year for creative writers and for artists in all media. And it's a wonderful synergy between the academic scholars, the creative writers, the visual artists, and many others who come here to pursue research in the original sources. Barbara has also written 4 children's books, including the young adult biography Susan B. Anthony, Woman Suffragist. And she has written and produced award-winning programming for network and cable TV. She was elected to membership in the American Antiquarian Society in 1998 and is also a member of the Writers Guild of America, Biographers International, and the Authors Guild. Barbara's new book is Strong Passions, a Scandalous Divorce in Old New York. It appeared last month to glowing reviews in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. It was also one of the Times' weekly reading suggestions or recommendations the week before last. Tonight, we're going to get a sense of exactly why, as Barbara tells us about this story, how she reconstructed it, and why it matters. Barbara Weisberg.
Thank you, Scott. Let me know if I am too soft, too loud, whatever that may be. Being an artist in the archives here was quite an extraordinary experience. I'm sure those of you who know this institution know that the material here is remarkable and inimitable. The archivists are not only extraordinarily knowledgeable and skilled, but very kind about helping you unearth materials you've longed for but didn't even really know existed. And finally, as an artist in the archives, it's great fun to be here and share ideas with scholars and musicians and poets and painters. It's a wonderful cross-section of people. Of course, you don't have to be on a fellowship to work here. It's open, it's welcoming, and it's wonderful. And increasingly, their materials are digitized, and so you can access them from wherever you are. And now to my book, Strong Passions. Strong Passions tells the true tale of a supposedly storybook marriage in the 1850s that ended catastrophically in the 1860s. The husband, Peter Remsen Strong, and his wife, Mary Stevens Strong, were wealthy, upper class, and were said at their wedding to be very much in love and ideally matched. So what happened? I'm going to read a brief passage that suggests one of the many reasons for the marriage's failure. The passage involves several of the book's main figures, including Peter and Mary, their 3 little daughters, among them their toddler named Edith, and Peter's brother Edward, who was about to go off to war. War and politics now intruded on conversations in every household, as they had ever since Confederate troops fired on federally owned Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861. A few days after the attack, only weeks into his first term, the newly elected Republican President Abraham Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the South's insurrection and end the War of Rebellion. Lincoln initially summoned the volunteers for just 3 months of service, a sadly optimistic estimate of the Union Army's needs. Edward answered the call to sign up in support of the Union cause, enlisting in the 45th Regiment of the United States Army of Volunteers. Edward was assigned as an aide-de-camp to General John G. Foster, a commander participating in a naval offensive called the Burnside Expedition. Edward traveled to Washington to receive his orders, then returned to New York for a few days before reporting for duty. He stayed with Mary, Peter, and his 3 little nieces. Christmas had always been a festive time for Mary. She well remembered her mother's lavish annual Christmas party, but war shadowed this one. Everyone worried about Edward's safety. Ever a skilled seamstress, Mary sewed a dressing gown for the new soldier, a gift for him to take to North Carolina. He was, after all, a widower with no one else to care for him, and Edith's godfather. He also was Mary's friend. Her efforts mirrored that of countless other women who poured their patriotic fervor and love of family into producing flannel shirts, drawers, socks, mittens, slippers, and other items of clothing for their family members, friends, and other soldiers. On December 23rd, Edith came down with a cough. What seemed to be a cold continued through Christmas. Several days after Christmas, Edward left for Baltimore. By the time he left, Edith had steadily worsened and now burned with fever. Her parents took turns staying by her bedside, dread and sorrow building as they watched their little daughter suffer and toss. There was little they could do but pray. Children as young as Edith's older sister, Mamie, and sister Allie understood the fragility of life, even of their own lives. The family physician, Dr. Watson, visited daily, but his efforts, mostly herbal remedies, a tiny bit of morphine to quiet the terrible coughing, and compresses, were ineffective. Edith died of influenza, a term broadly used for a respiratory infection, on January 2nd, 1862. A small, sad notice in the New York Times on January 4th read simply, "Strong, in this city, Thursday evening, January 2nd, Edith, youngest child of Peter R. and Mary E. Strong, aged 14 months." The night after Edith's funeral, January 5th, Mary, Peter, Mamie, and Allie sat together at home, grieving their loss. Mamie read aloud a chapter from the Bible. When she finished, Mary and Peter kissed the two little girls and sent them to bed. Afterward, Peter thought about the Bible passage Mamie had read, which focused on the relationship between love and duty. It seemed to him that over the last few years, a certain distance, a kind of casual disregard, had appeared in his relationship with Mary. When they were together, they no longer behaved tenderly toward one another as they had at the start of their marriage. They also were known on occasion to speak harshly to one another, and they increasingly spent time apart. Now, in the wake of Edith's death, Peter felt it was time to repair the problems in his marriage. He wished, he said, to resume marital duties, surely a euphemism for more frequent sexual intercourse. He moved his chair closer to Mary's and addressed her awkwardly. He suggested that the Bible passage they had heard might inspire them to find a way to renew joy in their marriage. He reached out and took her hand, a simple gesture he had rarely made in recent years. In response, and to his unspeakable shock, Mary pulled away, hurled herself at Peter's feet, and sobbed, "Oh, forgive me, forgive me. You cannot conceive how guilty I have been." For almost 2 years, Mary confessed, she had been having an affair with Peter's brother, Edward, to all appearances a paragon of virtue, a good-hearted widower, church deacon, godfather to baby Edith, and now a Union soldier. So, Strong Passions is 5 parts, and that passage ends part 1. So as you can see, there is much more to come. I like to think of Strong Passions as 3 stories in one: an intimate portrait of a couple's troubled relationship, a courtroom drama, and a historical saga about a divorce trial's impact on 3 generations of 2 well-to-do and influential old New York families. Mary Stevens was the daughter of John Austin Stevens, a powerful banker at the head of New York's largest bank, and the man who spearheaded the change during the Civil War from a system of state banks to a federal banking system. John Austin Stevens was also the great-uncle of a little girl born a generation after Mary, named Edith, Mary's first cousin once removed, who would grow up to become the famous writer Edith Wharton. As many of you know, Wharton was America's grand chronicler of marriage and divorce in an age of transition, and she also wrote extensively about the elite circle of what she called Old New York, an insular world comprised largely of the city's wealthy merchants, bankers and their families, people like the Stevenses, who prided themselves on their good character, discretion, and upright behavior, whatever hypocrisy might have concealed less admirable behavior. If any of you have watched HBO's The Gilded Age, the role played by Christine Baranski, Mrs. Van Ryn, is an example of a woman from the world of old New York. Mary's husband, Peter Remsenstrong, also hailed from the world of old New York. His forebears on both sides were wealthy merchants, and on his mother's side, they were Long Island landowners. One of his cousins and also a dear friend, George Templeton Strong, was a lawyer noted today for keeping a diary from 1835 to 1875 that is one of the important resources scholars now turn to for information about New York City and the nation during that 40-year period. George, an astute and often highly acerbic observer, attended Peter and Mary's wedding in 1853 and watched the ceremony with a hopeful heart, and over the years wrote with very moving grief as he watched the deterioration of his cousin Peter's marriage. I was first drawn to the story of the Strong's disastrous relationship for the sheer drama of its twists and turns. Mary's confession eventually leads to a divorce trial that shocks the public with headlines not only about Mary's alleged adultery, but also about abortion, child abduction, and Peter's alleged adultery. The story also fascinated me because it seemed an example of particularly bad behavior in an era that we think about. This is a decade before the notoriously racy Gilded Age, that we think about as prim and proper. It seemed to me to defy conventional myths about the world of genteel Victorian America. And finally, I was interested in the story because it offered a chance to look at the history of laws and attitudes and tensions surrounding marriage, gender roles, and sexuality at the time the story took place. It didn't for a moment occur to me when I began my research a number of years ago that the issues I was interested in as 19th century American history would be back in the headlines again today, now, as current events. Among them, currently in contention, abortion and contraception, the nature of what a marriage is or should be, and even the ready availability of divorce. In fact, Strong Passions is a primer on the horrors of divorce and divorce laws that decreed one partner or the other had to be at fault for a marriage's failure. Those kinds of divorce laws were what contributed to the mess that I write about in this book. Obviously, as with any marriage, there were many reasons why the Strong marriage collapsed. One probably was temperament. Peter was said to be genial and good-hearted, but he was something of a social butterfly. He lived on an inherited income. He was a lawyer who chose not to work, but kept an office in Manhattan anyway, primarily for show. He was a sportsman and a clubman who loved socializing with his friends. He was also a dilettante poet, and his cousin George criticized him for babbling far too much about high art and tone. He was something, according to George, of a bore. Mary was said to be beautiful, charming, a sparkling conversationalist, educated, and to have a deeper, more serious nature than Peter. She was also quite urbane, having lived in the bustling world of Manhattan all her life. After their honeymoon, Peter, for a variety of reasons, moved his city bride out of the city onto his wealthy mother's estate, Waverly, a large rural family compound in what was then bucolic Queens, where all his brothers and sisters and their spouses and children lived. Mary was not only separated from the city and her own friends and family, but she longed for a home of her own as befitted a member of her social class, somewhere where she could be mistress of her own household. Over the next few years, she had 3 daughters and was a good mother, but she remained something of an outsider at Waverly, criticized by her in-laws as prideful, and Peter was often away, a man about town, visiting his office and clubs in Manhattan. Thank you. The marriage's failure may also have been due to the institution of marriage itself, how it was conceived and idealized at the time, and how Mary adapted to it. Marriage was revered as the foundation of the family, the social order, and the state itself, and as sanctified by God. Both single and married women were generally regarded as inferior intellectually to men and were denied the right to vote, sit on a jury, speak in public, attend most colleges, or work in a chosen profession. Married women, however, also were denied a legal identity separate from their husbands, and they had little control over their activities, bodies, or finances. Birth control was unreliable and frowned upon, given the biblical command to be fruitful and multiply, and the cultural notion that a woman's highest calling was motherhood also was a burden often on women. Women, whatever their social class, were expected to obey their husbands, submit sexually to his wishes, maintain harmony, avoid controversy, provide comfort, offer companionship, run the household, and bear and raise children. Many women lived in a continuous cycle of pregnancy, confinement, recovery, child rearing, and again, pregnancy. Mary Strong's mother bore 12 children, only 9 of whom lived beyond a few years. In an era that predated modern medicine, some women feared, and with good reason, the risks of childbirth to both mother and child. Not surprisingly, agitation for women's rights in the wake of the Seneca Falls Convention had become an issue that people, whether they approved or disapproved of it, were aware of. It's unclear how the affair between Edward and Mary began. Peter certainly hadn't foreseen that living on the family compound would throw his handsome, bereft brother and his beautiful, restless wife together. Supposedly, the inadvertent touch of their fingers over a cup of tea was said to ignite fiery passion between them. But it might have been far more complicated. There are many unresolved mysteries in the Strong stories, which allow readers, like jury members, to examine the evidence and make up their own minds about certain elements of this story. After Mary confessed to adultery with her brother-in-law, Peter's rage was briefly alleviated by the fact that Edward was now out of the picture, gone to war, and Mary's repentance seemed to him sincere and heartfelt. At first, the couple chose not to divorce, but rather to maintain the appearance of marriage, living under the same roof, but avoiding one another's company and sleeping separately. Not a particularly happy arrangement. They did it because divorce at the time was not only exceedingly rare and difficult to get, but viewed as an abomination, especially among the upper class. In every state, one partner or the other had to be found at fault for the failure of a marriage, and in New York, divorce would be granted on the grounds of one fault only: adultery. So to sue for divorce was to advertise infidelity and leave oneself open to scandal in the press, the most salacious details of your life revealed, especially upsetting within a social circle that again prided itself on at least the appearance of uprightness and discretion. Another problem with attempting to divorce was the possibility that after all the scandal and publicity, the suit could be denied or rejected. Bizarrely, if both partners accused one another of adultery and a jury found both partners guilty of adultery, a divorce would be denied. So the unhappy couple would be doomed to live together miserably for the rest of their lives, their reputation in tatters. So, double adultery did you no good. Peter was loath to divorce, partly because it threatened publicity and a loss of status. It promised multiple losses for Mary, because there was, of course, a double standard. Humiliating as a divorce might be for a husband, for a woman, it was worse. Most women depended on their husbands for income, as there were few jobs available to women except teaching or perhaps factory work. So a divorced woman immediately lost financial stability. She almost always lost custody of her children. In a patriarchal society, the husband was considered best able to care for them and to have ownership of them. And since women were supposed to be pure and genteel, a woman divorced for adultery became a so-called fallen woman, ruined, a pariah in society, and often cast out even by her own family. In the case, however, of the Strongs, though they wanted to avoid divorce, that effort collapsed almost immediately because new complications came up. Mary announced she was pregnant, and it was unclear whose baby it was. Peter was, of course, horrified, and in fact, Mary then had either a miscarriage or an abortion that Peter was said to have forced upon her, a condition for his forgiveness. Whether she had a miscarriage or an abortion is unclear, another one of the story's mysteries. The fact that abortion played a role in the Strongs' marriage and divorce prompted me to look at the history of abortion in America. Earlier in the 19th century, probably the first third, abortions pre-quickening, the first 4 or 5 months before the first detectable movements of the child in the womb, abortions pre-quickening were performed frequently and largely ignored. But by mid-century, anti-abortion laws had strengthened, and abortions pre-quickening by chemical or surgical means was a misdemeanor, and post-quickening a second-degree manslaughter. Still, abortion was largely considered a woman's business unless a problem arose, like the mother was injured or died in the course of the procedure, that brought the procedure and the abortionist to the law's attention. Abortion generally, therefore, remained available and largely went unpunished until significantly later in the 19th century. After Mary's miscarriage or abortion, Peter finally moved forward to file for a divorce, and the story's twists and turns continued. The couple separated, and Mary countersued Peter, accusing him of having an affair with none other than the alleged abortionist. The abortionist was, in fact, Peter's tenant in a rental building he owned, so he did know her, and she was said to have supplied him with instruments and instructions for performing the said abortion. As the situation further deteriorated, battles over custody of the Strongs' 2 surviving daughters, Mamie, now around 8, and Allie, around 5, ensued. When the older girl, Mamie, visited Peter, he refused to let her return to her mother's care. When it looked like Peter would get custody of both daughters, as was customary in tradition and the law, Mary took the younger one when she had the opportunity and disappeared with her. When the case finally came to trial, it was a circus. The jury consisted of 12 middle-class white men, typically, as was typical, and witnesses were summoned to testify from all walks of life. A governess, a laundress, doctors, cops, the abortionist's husband, a coachman, angry and accusatory relatives, and wealthy friends like Teddy Roosevelt's uncle. Teddy was 7 years old at the time. Everyone told a different story. Did Mary seduce Edward, or did Edward rape her, which Mary's sister insisted happened? Did Peter indeed have an affair with the abortionist, or was that just a story made up by Mary's vengeful father, John Austin Stevens, to sully Peter's reputation? After 5 weeks, each side rested its case, and the judge gave the jury their instructions, and the jury retired to deliberate. And with your indulgence, I'm going to read another piece from the book. The jurors retired to the jury room shortly after noon. Courtroom observers whispered among themselves, taking bets on the verdict. Most thought that it would favor Peter and that jurors would deliberate no more than an hour. They were wrong. 2 hours passed. Spectators wandered out into the daylight, shielding their eyes from the bright sunshine after the dim courtroom. Some sat on benches in City Hall Park, savoring the unseasonably warm weather. Several undoubtedly dashed across the street to the oyster bars on Broadway, slurping down the slippery morsels to appease their hunger and pass the time. Others, standing on the grimy tax building steps to catch a breath of fresh air, exchanged gossip or chatted about matters unrelated to the trial. As members of the courtroom crowd came and went, the same questions were repeated. What's happening? What have you heard? Will it be long now? George Templeton Strong left the courtroom, still packed with people, at 5 p.m., dined uptown, and took the omnibus back downtown at 9 p.m. to see whether there'd been a verdict. He passed by Union Square at 14th Street, the northern outskirts of the city, when he and his cousin Peter were young, currently surrounded by elegant homes. The previous April, its greenery had been draped solemnly in black for Lincoln's funeral. The city now extended well beyond Union Square, even beyond 59th Street, site of the newly created, still unfinished, paradise of Central Park. A line of streetlights like tall sentinels brightened Broadway's long expanse. George passed by Bleecker Street, packed with boarding houses, where the Stevens family once lived in the handsome townhouse where George had met his wife, both of them guests at a long-ago Christmas party. George passed by shops, restaurants, hotels, churches, taverns, the neighborhoods getting shabbier as he traveled south. Broadway was lively and crowded in many places, but largely hushed in the business district where shops were closed. The New York Times building and other newspaper and printing businesses were still bustled with activity. The cupola of City Hall Park towered over the silent park below, its paths and benches empty in the night. George disembarked, walked to the courthouse, and found its doors locked, but the lights shining in the jury room windows, the jurors still deliberating. The jurors remained there all night. They argued and slept and discussed and rested, one reporter wrote. Another newsman added that they were snug alongside a good fire. Affable Edward Draper, the foreman, helped keep tempers in check. Robert Mackey catnapped on the floor, snoring as if he were home in bed. That morning, Saturday, December 30th, a brutal snowstorm buried the city, as hard and cold and spiteful and bitter and malevolent as John Austin Stevens, George Templeton Strong wrote. The jurors peered out at the howling gusts, their minds on the travails of getting home in the storm and the festivities of the coming New Year celebrations. So, I'm not going to tell you what the verdict was or what the jurors decided. I will tell you that Strong Passions, a scandalous divorce in old New York, goes on to trace the lives of all the major figures involved in the trial, including that of the little girl Mary abducted, the little girl's life when she grows up. I told you earlier why I was first drawn to the story of the Strongs, but I didn't tell you that I initially encountered their story right here in the American Antiquarian Society when I was researching material for another book, Talking to the Dead, which Scott told you a little bit about. That book, like Strong Passions, traced the true story of a family that received extraordinary publicity in mid-19th century America for scandalous deeds. And that book, like Strong Passions, looks at unresolved mysteries and asks readers to judge for themselves some aspect of what transpired. At the time, I was an artist in residence here, and one of the Society's amazing librarians brought me a copy of the Diary of George Templeton Strong, Peter Strong's cousin, which I had never heard of. George's diary indeed covered material that I needed for my book Talking to the Dead, but it also introduced me to the sorrowful tale of Peter's divorce, happening at a time when no one divorced. George's grief, disgust, and worry about his cousin's situation captured my imagination. I never forgot it, and many years later returned to it. And over the last years, confined and isolated during the pandemic, research more or less at a halt, I discovered and worked extensively on a website called America's Historical Newspapers, without realizing at the time, and until much later, that it consisted of the American Antiquarian Society's collections. But to return to Strong Passions, I feel great sympathy for both Peter and Mary Strong, flawed human beings trapped in an unhappy marriage. But I feel special empathy for Mary, living, however privileged she was, in a world where she couldn't go to college, work in a chosen profession, be responsible for her own money, speak in public, sit on a jury, control her own body, an adult woman. Women, of course, didn't get the vote until 1920, and in New York, women couldn't sit on a jury until 1937. I remember restrictions on women in my lifetime in the late 60s, where I went to college in the frigid and snowy Northeast. I had to wear a skirt to class, wasn't allowed to wear jeans or slacks, had to look demure unless there was a really serious blizzard. Married women like my older sister couldn't easily keep their so-called maiden names or get credit cards without their husband's approval. And in some states, which I think many of you know, not only abortion but contraception was against the law. In the 1970s, both contraception and abortion were judged rights guaranteed under the Constitution. In 2022, it was decided that there is no constitutional right to abortion, and the matter has been left to the states. Many such laws affect not only women, but the lives of both men and women, and how they coexist together, how we live together, marry, or part from one another. One example, New York was the last state to enact no-fault divorce in 2010. Now there is talk in at least some states of reinstituting fault-based divorce, of making it more difficult and complicated once again to end a marriage. As I did my research, I saw over and over again, illustrated in the strong story, that the laws and attitudes affecting many of what we call family value issues have never been static, even when we deem them God-given or wish them irrevocably embedded in the Constitution. For better or worse, they have always been a work in progress, subject to change and human will, advancing and reversing course in a perpetual tug of war to shape the future. Thank you. I think
We'll take questions either from our audience here in Antiquarian Hall or on YouTube. And Nan has a microphone and can bring that around to folks who have questions. So please raise your hand.
there is a
So I need to know who was at the courthouse for 5 weeks following all of the details of this divorce. Like, were they just housewives? Were they his colleagues at work? Like, didn't people have things to do? Like, it just, that's, yeah.
Spectators come and go. I think even now when you have a celebrity trial, people will pack the courthouse, but they can't always be there. You had relatives on both sides, Mary's relatives and Peter's relatives. You had packs of journalists. You had people who knew the families and people who were just curiosity seekers, because the scandal really had been publicized far and wide. The press carried the story from New York all the way to San Francisco, north and south.
And did Peter and Mary take the stand during this trial?
Sorry. Did Peter and Mary each take the stand during this trial?
Mary never reappeared during the trial. She and Allie remained fugitives. She is very alive during the trial because everybody testifies about her. She was a virgin. She was a whore. Who was she? So she is present. She haunts the courtroom. Peter is there as an observer. He is never called to testify. He is quiet. He is no longer the jovial man about town that we have seen him be earlier in the book. He is sometimes, particularly when the children are talked about, he breaks down in tears.
Who watches the girl that wasn't taken? Like, what happens to her throughout this entire trial period?
Good question. Mamie has stayed with Peter, and Peter continues to live on the family compound. of Waverly in bucolic Queens. We all know. And Mamie, in fact, is surrounded by loving relatives, aunts and uncles. I mean, for Mary, it was too much. I mean, aunts and uncles and cousins, and her grandmother is there. And in that respect, she has a fairly stable life, but you have to, I've always thought how sad it must have been to be the one left behind by her mother. So, and she had lost her little sister Edith. There were multiple losses for Mamie, but she did grow up in a relatively stable environment with many loving relatives around her. And at one point we see her as an adult, and she is said to be a lovely young woman. So
this is the time just before yellow journalism begins. How salacious did the newspapers report this at the time, and did they have an influence on the jury, or were they sequestered? They probably weren't sequestered. They'd go home. How much influence did they play on that?
Well, I have to say they were allowed to go home, but I also read that there were newspapers in the jury room while they were deliberating. So I don't think it was quite as strict as we may think of these things today. It was salacious. There was much talk about who slept in whose bed. There was a lot of talk about women's menstruation. There was talk of, birthing and sex, and it was salacious indeed. There were very vivid medical descriptions also of everybody's different anatomy. So, does that answer? I'm obviously not as salacious as the newspapers. I'm a little more guarded than they were.
Thank you. That was riveting. Could you talk a little bit more about how you understand what marriage signifies at this period? Because I'm thinking, of course, about like in the 19th century, you have this old quasi-medieval understanding of marriage as this kind of alliance or financial arrangement between two wealthy families. And if you happen to like your spouse, all the better, but you didn't have to. And then, of course, you have the kind of rise of companionate marriage, right, where you are expected to fall in love with your spouse and actually enjoy their company. And it seems like both of these kind of competing understandings of marriage are at play here in the divorce case. Allegedly, right? So I wonder if you might talk about how you understand what marriage meant in this really uneven context.
I would say it was certainly a period of transition because, as you point out, until then it was a kind of economic matching of families and interests. And certainly the Stevenses and the Strongs were co-equal families of influence in old New York. So the families must have been delighted. But from everything I read, it was also a love match. They met, were charmed by one another, had some interests in common, traveling and seeing the monuments of Europe, and enjoyed one another. Were lively young people. But marriage still was influenced by the whole concept of coverture, which is that a woman's identity was wholly covered by her husband's identity. So she really lost the ability to be a separate person, to control her money, to sign contracts, to enter into agreements without his permission. And sexually, there was no concept of marital rape. She was, dependent on her husband to listen to her wishes. And she really had no protection, or very little protection, against a brutal husband if she was married to one. There's no indication that Peter was brutal or harsh, or just, my interpretation is just kind of insensitive and unaware. Neither one of them was perfect. One of the newspaper people at the very end of this says, seemed to him that they deserved one another. Very sad comment.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the fact that there was a war on, and I missed some of the chronology. It sounds as if the trial started after the war ended, the Civil War.
The trial is, yes, thank you. The trial is in November of 1865.
Okay.
So April is when Lincoln is assassinated. Is that when you have and Appomattox has already happened?
So I kind of wondered if this conflict, this turmoil, had in journalists' minds or the public mind something to do with the recent battles raging throughout the nation.
Journalists absolutely compared the Civil War to a divorce. They use that as a metaphor. And at the start of the book, I found a quote from the wife of a Confederate general, Mary Chesnut. Some of you know that diary where she says, we are divorcing North from South, and if only we could have learned to be more civil to each other. So that, as a metaphor, is out there, and I think, along with divorce being almost impossible to get at that time, I think the divorce metaphor for the war heightened interest in what was the Strong's case. But I think the Strong's case also, as with celebrity breakups today, different. In the Strong's time, I kept talking about discretion. Now, the celebrities themselves, the people involved, the rich and famous loved to have it out there. That wasn't true. One of the issues for the Strongs was that they really did not want publicity. But I think the public fascination was in part because it distracted them from the war. It was a circus, and it was exciting to read about and not depressing and sad, and you weren't thinking about wounded relatives when you were reading about the Strongs.
I have a quick question, and then we've got others in the audience. Do we have any on YouTube? We do. Okay. I just wanted to very quickly ask, you describe these characters so beautifully. Are there portraits of them? Are there any images of the characters?
I was amazed and even sought help here, where I thought if there was anything, I would find it here. Very few images, and actually, I think a lot of papers and letters were destroyed. There are 3 images that I found. That one is Jasper. I can't remember the name of the painter, David. An Impressionist painter, Hudson River School painter, was a friend of Peter's, and he painted Waverly. Wonderful painting. That exists. Peter at one point had a marble bust made of Mary. This would have been well into the marriage, and that an image of that exists. We don't know where the bust is. The most, I think, heartrending image is in George Templeton Strong's original diary, what I read here was the print edition, which is magnificent. But the original diaries are in the New York Historical Society. And in the pages, it's like 2,000 pages, 4 volumes, there is a sketch that's labeled The Strong Girls. And there you have these 2 little faces, Mamie and Allie, these just beautiful little children. And that's really the only image I found that had any real oomph to it, impact to it. Everything was pretty well, I think, kind of cleared out, or I couldn't find it.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question from our virtual audience.
Joan says, you decided not to recreate dialogue, something that writers of creative nonfiction sometimes do. Could you talk about your choices as a writer of a narrative that rests on speculation and research?
I did not want to invent dialogue, actually not out of any something of an ethical concern, but more because I'm not a fiction writer, and that would have required, I think, a gift for fiction. My husband is a wonderful fiction writer, and I envy him. So, A, I couldn't do it, and B, I didn't want to do it. There is speculation. There are, in some instances, this may have happened, that may have happened. But I actually think they're relatively few, and I always try to cue readers when I'm speculating. And what I do like about this story, and I liked it about the Fox sisters, in both books I realized I really love things that are unresolved, that I can actually say there are some things here that I can't know and that readers will need to decide for themselves. And in both books, though I didn't do it intentionally and I didn't even realize I had done it until later, the last chapters basically present scenarios. These are my assumptions. These are the possibilities of what I believe could have gone on. Now it's in your hands. I've given you the evidence I have. I've given you my theories. And now it's up to you. So that was I think tackling that kind of story was the first writer's decision I made. I don't know if that answers Joan's question, but.
I'm sorry, sneaking up on me. Not to compare books because it was quite a bit different, but a year or two ago there was a book called The Great Divorce came out.
Oh, that's a wonderful book.
But now that divorce happened before this case. Did they use precedents in those days to make a case in courts, or was that any case that went before just forgotten about and started fresh each time? Or?
When I say divorce was rare, I do mean divorce was rare. But that doesn't mean there weren't divorces. What made this divorce particularly unusual was that it happened among the Tony upper class. That was really significant. That would increasingly happen, but that had not happened. The world of old New York was insular. And this, in effect, pulled the veil aside and said, what we all now know, here are all the secrets. They're just as dirty and seamy and sinful as we are. So there were divorces. That's an interesting case and a wonderful book. And there were other divorces, but what often happened was, because divorce was so difficult to get, and either people who didn't have a lot of money just separated. Men would head west if they had a lot of money also. The rich might go to Europe. They didn't even bother with divorce in some instances. Other instances, there was the possibility of private settlement, or there were, in certain instances, the possibility of a separation from bed and board. But those really, private settlements could sometimes work. The bed and board left you with all the encumbrances of marriage and all the scandal without leaving you free to remarry. So it wasn't a very successful solution. But people often just split. But the fact that they were upper class was really what was distinctive about the Strongs.
So we have one more question, time for one more on YouTube, and then we have one more in the room here, and then I think we need to wrap up. Go ahead.
Caroline asks, do you know what happened to the surviving daughters?
I do. I will say that in the book we are able, we are able through public records to track what happens to them, and in the case of one of them, I will say that there is a scandal that actually rivals her parents. So when she grows up. That's all I'm going to say about the children.
Barbara, this is a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've talked eloquently about the sources you used, particularly your primary sources. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, and specifically what was most useful to you. Not only the primary sources, the Strong diaries and the newspapers, but secondary sources, the historians that are working today who you read and that kind of gave you a better sense of the overall age.
I will do that. To do that, I have to look at my own bibliography because my memory on many things has dimmed in the very brief time it's been since I finished the book. One primary source that was just extraordinary that I felt really lucky to find was Mary's sister kept a bunch of letters except for the 5 years surrounding the divorce. Gone. But I found her letters. They were actually online. You too could find them, but it was such a miracle to find them. They were on a family website. And she gives a wonderful sense of the Stevens family, and that was a great find. I think, if I may look at my own sources, I love a book, it's an older book, called Lydia Pinkham and the Business of Women's Medicine by Sarah Stage. And that first sparked my interest in women's history, and it continues, I think, to be absolutely one of the absolute best books. I loved a book called In Pursuit of Privilege by a historian named Clifton Hood, excuse me. And I'm just kind of, I will here say, in New York, how many of you have ever visited the Merchant's House? There's a museum called the Merchant's House Museum, and it is exactly that. And when you think that New York is a city of merchants, this museum is a gem. And it's threatened by all sorts of development around it. One of the women who was deeply involved there as a curator wrote a book called An Old Merchant's House, Life at Home in New York City. And it's vivid and detailed and gives an extraordinary sense of what it was like to live in New York at that time. For banking and John Austin Stevens and the whole world of money at the time, I would recommend, though I certainly have my own biases, David Black's The King of Fifth Avenue, The Fortunes of August Belmont, admitting that David is my husband. So there is a little bit of bias there, but it's a wonderful book. And always Gotham, A History of New York. So,
Can we please say thank you again to Barbara Weisberg?
thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for this wonderful talk. As you can tell, and I'll turn this off, as you can tell, Barbara Weisberg brings the past to life, whether she's here with us in Antiquarian Hall or on the page. If you want more of the story, buy the book. If you are here with us in the hall tonight, we have our friends from Tide Pool Bookshop selling copies of the book out in the lobby, and Barbara would be delighted to autograph those for you if you would like. I invite all of you, if you want to recommend this program to friends and family, it will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. All of our programs are. We have a full slate of programs ahead, starting again next Tuesday night on March 26th, when Manisha Sinha will launch her new book at 7 p.m. here. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, in conversation with John Stauffer. Other public programs ahead include Duncan Faherty on his book, The Haitian Revolution in the Early Republic of Letters. That's next Thursday. And Sarah Kai's in a virtual program about her book, American Burial Ground, A New History of the Overland Trail. That's on April 11th. There's much more. Check it out on our website, americanantiquarian.org. For now, thank you so much to Barbara Weisberg, to all of you who are here tonight, whether in person or virtually, and have a good evening.